Welcome to another episode of Phrasally Verbocious. This week we have another guest with us to talk about the topic of pronunciation. Victor, would you like to say a few things about yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Victor. I am an English teacher based in Brazil, and that's where I spent most of my life, really. I have a BH in English and an MA in Linguistics, and I've always been quite interested about studying pronunciation, not only in English, but also in Portuguese and other languages as part of the phonology concentration I took at uni. And that's pretty much it. I've been teaching for as long as I can remember. This is my career, really. So I'm very happy about it. But anyway.
I think we're all in that stage now of teaching as long as I can remember.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
possibly
So
slightly longer.
Hard to remember. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's great to have you on because I know you have a great interest in pronunciation, as you just mentioned. So as a Portuguese and I suppose also a Spanish speaker, what problems do you encounter in terms of English pronunciation?
Right. Sorry, and first of all, and thank you for having me, obviously. Well, I mean, this is my first time doing this. I'm sorry if I do anything stupid, by the way.
We can edit all that out, don't worry.
Well, you can see that the struggle just to start this is very strong evidence of that. But regarding Portuguese and Spanish, for lots of reasons, despite South America being divided like those two languages almost evenly, we're not very as closely connected as one would probably expect. And when we have conferences with teachers from Spanish-speaking countries, for instance, and they join us, we are usually actually separate. We almost never engage much in discussion, or we don't really take the opportunity to talk about our concerns, which is quite saddening because there's so many things which both languages share regarding the challenges that students face. For instance, if you think of one of the most common characteristics we have is the fact that how stress works in both Portuguese and Spanish, especially in Brazil. Because as English is a very stress-timed language, we have a very different pattern of the way we organize the chunks in a sentence,
Right.
as opposed to Portuguese and Spanish, where things are the syllables in the words don't usually get reduced as much, for instance. So a sentence such as "I've been waiting for you" and "I'm waiting for you" in English would almost take the same amount of time to be uttered. In Portuguese, if I say eu tenho or eu venho te esperando e eu te espero, have completely different time frames because all the syllables are quite well, fixed in length. So this is something that we also see in Spanish, not only in Latin America, but it also includes the European varieties. So this is one of the things that we definitely see as a shared issue for teachers of English there, because whenever we're teaching our students, we might have a tendency to grade our language too much to the point that we start speaking with our stress pattern. So rather than saying, how are
That's
you?
interesting.
We'll start saying, how are you? Almost like a robot.
That's quite a good point, yeah.
Mixing the syllables too much. So our students will have our model with our one language stress pattern.
Do you think then there's a difference between then using your teacher voice, which I do whatever I can to not sound like where I'm from in the first place. Right. That's political. But do you think there's a difference between a teacher voice and then almost without meaning to get the pronunciation wrong? So when when kids come in and they're probably like A2, is there an issue then of using a teacher voice that is too teachery voice, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, it does makes perfect sense. As I see it, maybe this is an issue for us when the teacher who's teaching the target language is not the native speaker, because we have a tendency that when the foreign speaker grades the language that this person is teaching, we'll kind of incorporate more things from our target, from our first language. And a speaker like you guys who have English as your first language, intuitively, even if you grade it very much, if you use a very teachery voice, you will still be bound by the constraints that the language has on you. So you won't probably know how to break the syllable patterns into a Spanish-induced kind of way. But for us, I think that will be an issue, which is something we have been discussing with teachers here in some conferences in Brazil, of trying to use some techniques which are very widespread. But it's just this thing of trying to demystify this idea that the only way for students to feel at ease in an A1 level class, for instance, is if we speak in a very slow way, but in a slow way that almost resembles Portuguese or Spanish.
Okay.
So I think it is more dangerous if the first language of the teacher is the same as the students, because we have just to at least try and focus on trying to set the limit there. Where am I speaking Portuguese or am I English? Am I speaking English here? You see, I don't know.
That's interesting. And how can you get so how do you get students to notice or at least to get right then the stress timing?
Right.
What do you do with them?
For instance, I think one of the biggest things for us is to try to at least tell them that maybe one of the simplest concepts we can try to express in classes is this idea of a content word versus a grammar word. Showing that English will rely very much on the content words in a sentence. In Portuguese, this is definitely not the same. So a grammar word and a content word will basically sound and take the same amount of time to be spoken. So if I'm teaching something such as, I have an English book here with me, so I can just read the sentence, is the idea that we live in a web of communications. How odd is that? The idea that we live in a web of communications. So communications will be the most prominent word in the sentence. So one of the things we have been trying to do with lower levels is to, especially for when pronunciation is an issue, is to try to use some back chaining. For instance, I think this is really helpful because we have an issue of English words when they are long. We speakers of Portuguese and Spanish train to break the syllables in a very even way. So this calls another issue called intelligibility. So for instance, words such as communications, we try to break the syllables to say something such as shens and ations, nacations, communications to activate auditory memory. So going backwards, then using the idea of back chaining. And for the whole sentence, we're trying to break into the chunks that we have in the sentence, such as a web of communications, in a web of communications, we live in a web of communications, and the idea that we live in a web of communications. So this is more of a teachery way I'm using, but I'm trying just to emphasize the content words. And this is something we've been trying to tell our students to focus on the words that they can really understand. Because usually they do, it's just like, I want to understand everything. But obviously this is not something that no one does.
Yeah.
So at least we've been trying to, bridge this gap of not showing them so much the word as it's spelled, obviously, and trying to at least emphasize more the content words. So they see that there's a pattern here going on, which is the one that English requires for their intelligibility to be attained.
I think another issue that I encounter a lot, in fact, I was talking to a teacher friend, well, I could just say friend, couldn't I, really, about yesterday was past simple, regular ED, and that pronunciation pattern. Is that something that you encounter as a problem as well?
It definitely is. What happens most of the time when it kind of comes down to this characteristic of Portuguese and English being so similar, and yet people forget about that. We have a tendency that when we look at a word in Portuguese or in Spanish, it's the pronunciation is pretty much intuitive. We don't have many variations in how vowels are pronounced. We don't have many variations of how stress is placed. It's all there in the word. Portuguese is not as transparent as Spanish, but we're still very close. So when we see the letter E in the past forms, both us in Brazil and people in Portugal, obviously, and Spanish speakers, we will want to pronounce that word. It feels, especially for lower level learners, that it's unthought of, unheard of. How do I not pronounce that? Why wouldn't I pronounce it? It's there. It's part of it, right? And this is one of the things I've seen this teaching adults recently. Especially because of that, it's a common difficulty they show. So words such as worked or learned, which they use a lot, when they see the word, if I teach that word, and they say, and the first thing they usually ask me is, "Can I see the word that you're saying? Can you write it down?" I was right, I can, but let's focus on the pronunciation first. Let's see if you can get it right first. Because as soon as I show, like maybe if I have to teach maybe 7 or 8 words in a lesson, and so many of them have this characteristic, when they start seeing it again, and maybe for some reason they start reading it, they will rely on the spelling, and some of the words will get with the E magically being pronounced again. So even if I really take the time to say worked and learned and wished, there's wished, worked, or learned, because of this. This is a really tight grip we have with our first languages, right? So it's really a work of patience, I would say, but it's really worth it if you are patient enough with lower levels. But this is definitely, we have to blame our first language for that. We are very comfortable with the fact that the spelling helps us so much, and in English, not very much, right? So,
it's interesting you say how much of a grip our first language has on us, because it's something that has come up a couple of times in recent episodes, but or like the difference between our feelings and our connection with it. But the when you're talking about wanting to pronounce all of the syllables in a long English word, it was making me think about how I have the opposite problem or have had the opposite problem when learning Spanish and wanting to not pronounce all of the syllables in very long Spanish words. Because natively I want to contract and cut things down. So it's interesting how it does work in both. It does work in both directions.
Absolutely.
Okay. I'm just wondering about how. Well, I think I think I speak for both Alan and I if I say I think your pronunciation is very nice, Victor. How?
You're too kind.
I suppose that wasn't the case when you were.
I feel like I'm doing a speaking exam right now. You have no idea. I seriously feel like I'm doing the proficiency test again.
Well, I think you're probably more likely that you'd pass it than the two of us.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Oh, wow.
Because you've learned it, because we just take shortcuts. No, I'm just wondering, because obviously I'm making the assumption that you weren't some sort of language learning child prodigy and spoke this with this pronunciation when you first started learning to speak English as a kid. What sort of things have you done to get the pronunciation to where you have it right now?
Right, that's one of the things I was mentioning. I don't know how long this has been discussed in English-speaking countries or in Spain, but in Brazil, when I started university, one of the most common, beliefs that I remember hearing quite often was, depending on how old you are when you start learning a language, your proficiency will be in such way. Meaning, the older you start learning it, the chances of you attaining a good level of proficiency reduces. And I was like, okay, I started after that magical number of 11 and 12. Something right. Okay, I am way late, way overdue here. What do I do now with my English? And because I started when I was 14 years old. Yeah, I was 14, 15. No, 13. I was 13, last year of primary school in Brazil. So, and what happens, just as some context, when we have English lessons in our regular schools, we only learn to read and write, and we have grammar lessons. We don't speak English in classes. We are not exposed to listening to English or anything like that. That's a common thing in most regular schools, unless you study in a very, how can I say, maybe wealthy based kind of school, then you might have a chance to have some don't like using the word there, but proper English lessons, meaning that you are going to communicate and learn really how to use the language.
Okay.
So I started going to this institute, this language institute, which is something quite common in several countries, when I was in year 9 here in Brazil. And so this was my first contact. But I've always been really interested in trying, being a good student. I've always really done my best to do well in school. I've always quite liked studying. I've always found interesting to know about English, but before it was because of most video games I used to play and watching films on TV, these kinds of things. I was always tried to understand what they're saying there, or trying to get the last word of the sentences, which kind of makes lots of sense today, because when we just say a sentence in English, usually if it's just declaring it, the last word is the one that is most prominent. It took me 10 years after I started studying to see that this was a pattern in English. But anyway, what did I do? Sorry, there's just too much context. But anyway, to me, it was really seeing this. There's a way of pronouncing the word. There's a way that we're expected to say it. For instance, if the word was wanted, and I heard my teacher saying it, I tried to copy what she used to say, for instance. And then when I heard something such as, for us, we have a tendency to insert a vowel at the end of words finishing with a consonant whenever we hear it. So a word such as wanted would say, in a more Brazilian way, we would sound like wanted. So we would add a syllable, we would nasalize a lot, we would change the last consonant, add a vowel, we basically would butcher the whole word. So I was, okay, if I say it in the way that I think I'm saying, and the teacher is saying a completely different one, the teacher might be right. Let's give her a chance. But honestly, so I would always just try to use her as a model, because I'm using this first teacher that I had as this case. And when I got to university and continued having lessons, and I started having lessons about pronunciation, I got exposed to the idea of using phonetic transcription. And because we've always seen these we've always seen them in the dictionaries, but I've always kind of ignored them because, okay, what do these symbols mean? And then now there's a way how you can pronounce the word. So it kind of started making sense to me. And when I saw the symbols, I really tried, okay, what do these symbols actually mean? And it's just by association I started doing these things. Now, okay, this is obviously very technical, and sometimes, we don't have many lessons on that. But for, let's say, real life kind of learning, it was trying to have a model. For instance, my first contact with English was with American English, and I used to watch lots of TV series like Friends and so many others. But Friends was probably the one that I followed for the longest time over my teenage years, and so it was my model. It's the one. So I used to have like maybe Chandler or Ross or Monica or one of the characters. Okay, that's how they speak English, so that's how I learned. And so this was, okay, I'll try to use them as, okay, this is how they say. This was a way. I remember even starting listening to words that sounded different by other American speakers, such as maybe extraordinary and extraordinary or something like that, and using the STA differences from West Coast and East Coast. And okay, so there's differences. Because obviously we have this tendency to believe there's only one American English, and that's the other thing called British English. When I saw those things, I said, okay, there's a different way, but I learned this one. So I've always tried to really stick to some sort of consistency, which luckily was something I also learned at university, and about really trying to at least choose one.
You mentioned a minute ago about having a late approach to English. Do you think the sort of, because you sort of touched on the critical period hypotheses, where they talk about you can only sound so good at a certain age, and then you completely lose that ability. Do you think that's a help or a hindrance for people? Do you think it's like, no, you're 14, or no, you're 22, learn a language, and you're only going to sound like this? Is that a negative thing to tell students, or for them to be aware of? Or do you think it's just one of those harsh things that sort of comes out of academic native speakers?
Yeah, that's what I felt for the longest time, until I started having lessons on language acquisition. Because this is obviously something that has been around for a while, and what I saw was that this really depends on so many other aspects. It's not just ph.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see some studies really trying to refute this idea that there is that kind of thing, or there's some more recent studies that say something such as your language performance will actually change before you're born, just in the development during pregnancy. So, which is something that we have seen, for instance, when babies who have parents speaking different languages, when they're born, the way that they start organizing their languages is already different from a baby from monolingual parents.
Yeah.
So, I mean, everything counts anyway. So it's obviously what I would see as would cause a problem is the comfort zone issue, if I can put it that way. Because the younger we are learning about a language, it becomes something, okay, just a language I'm learning. I know it's part of it. It's kind of become more organic. I know it's very buzzword, but for an older student, it's just maybe teaching them how to study it. And which is something that for younger students, we usually don't have to take the time to do because they're just so immersed in this environment of having to study. So I would say this is obviously just more of a belief nowadays than doing study, but I can get it backed up with some things. But it's more to do with the fact that adult students, they haven't been studying for a while. They're all in the labor market, so they have to relearn how to become students, right? So they have their beliefs that, well, they never learned the language. Many of them might feel, oh, English is so difficult because of this history in Brazil that English was this alien class that we had, and we never understood what the person was saying or telling us because we could only see things and it didn't match, right? The pronunciation never matched the spelling of the words. So I think, at least for a Brazilian context, it would have a lot to do with the experience that our students have with the language. So I would say I'm really happy to see and to say that there have been lots of students that I saw at very low levels, which are now reaching C1 and C2, and you can't tell when they started studying. If you just judge by their pronunciation, you say, "Oh, this person must have been studying since they were 7 or 8."
Yeah.
They started when they were 15, because I've been too long maybe at the school, so I've seen actually some cases. But I would say it's got much to do with the experience and how students take the studying language as part of the process. Because honestly, anyone can. It sounds utopian to say it, but anyone can.
But
learn.
I completely agree. Yeah, I think it'd be really interesting if there was, because you mentioned like from pregnancy and from when babies, if they're around multiple languages, would they see it differently? I haven't come across any studies, but I would be quite interested to see if there was like a longitudinal study on the sort of infamous WUG test. So for anybody who doesn't know, the WUG test is there's 2 fictional birds drawn on a page. The text reads, "This is a WUG. Now there is another one. There are 2 of them. There are 2." And if you're English L1, you automatically go, "There are 2 WUGs, WUGS." But then there's the second part. This is a glutch. It looks a bit like a goose. GUTCH. Now there's another one. There are 2 of them. There are 2. And then if your L1 is natively English, people tend to write, "There are 2 glutches" with ES in the end.
Right.
This is from Gleason did this test a long time ago. I would be quite interested to see the difference between, different L1s, and if people had been around a lot of languages from they were young, do they change their answers, sort of thing? It would be interesting to see how, if people who'd grown up from the year dot had been around, say, 3 or 4 different languages, does their answers change, or do they see those questions as completely different?
You mean if they ask those questions in different languages, or just in English?
Well, English would have to be one, but a similar test in, say, Spanish, pluralizing, or similar in Portuguese, pluralizing, or French, or whatever, just to see how people's brains work when they see an entirely new fictitious word.
It sounds like you've got your PhD research question, Anand.
Oh, not another one.
I want to pick up on something you mentioned earlier on. You were saying about noticing, oh, wait, people say this word differently depending on where they're from, and there isn't some sort of monolithic American or monolithic British accent. And here we are, two quote-unquote natives speaking with different accents. This is also, amongst my friends, famously also not my native accent. When I speak to people who come from where I come from, my accent magically changes as well.
This is my teacher voice as well, yeah.
You know, we were talking about World Englishes and stuff last episode with Claudia. You know, students maybe want to sound native, or, I mean, not all of them do actually, but some of them do. And I don't really know what to tell them half the time, because I don't know what the question means to begin with. I guess they have a particular model in their head, but I'm not sure it's particularly helpful. I was wondering, for someone who learned English as a second language, what would be the most useful thing to say to my students to dissuade them from wanting to sound like a certain way, or this idea of sounding like a native?
Right. You can only.
Or should I encourage them? Or should I encourage them?
This is something. This is maybe one of my favorite quotes from my years at uni, which is, "You will only sound like a native speaker if you are one." And I think it's really kind of brought me some solace to it, because it's not a lie. If you think of this example I gave you guys of the babies, which there are some interesting studies for Portuguese. I can talk about it in a different opportunity. But anyway, what would happen is this thing, especially for in a very traditional sense, bilingual children, the ones with parents speaking two languages, like maybe English and Spanish, which is a very common case in the US and some parts of the world. It's been reported that they usually take maybe 1 year longer than a monolingual child to master the language that they're studying. But obviously, this child is studying two languages, right? Is becoming fully proficient in two languages at the age of 5. Usually, that's usually the main number. A monolingual child becomes, let's say, proficient and fluent, like a native speaker, in the first language at the age of 4. And so when we transpose this to the scenario of learning as a second language, try to come up with these ideas. First, well, we will only sound really like a native if we are a native. There's something which is really interesting for us to try and see, because usually Brazil is a huge country, so usually this works. We have lots of different accents. We sound really, really different from one another just by when we just change states, because we have lots of other things that cause dialectal variations in the country, such as the mountains, lots of rivers. So this has helped us shape our accents in different ways. But anyway, what happens is, if I ask someone, have you got anyone in your family who's lived in a different state in Brazil? And have you ever noticed how different they sound? This is something that usually happens after just 3 months away. We don't sound the same. And it's really easy for a lay person to tell, okay, you're sounding different. You don't sound like you sound like you're too much from that place, or so and such. And this is something that usually, maybe at least, helps people understand, okay, if in my first language I start sounding different, let alone in the second one, which is one that I've got much less exposition to, right? For instance, I spent a month in Rio for holidays, and because of my contact with people from there, and for other reasons too, we intuitively start using things that are more commonly there. When I came back, my friends were like, "Oh, how long were you in Rio actually?" Because I was using something, and then I tuned back to my Mineiro accent. But you see, just because of a month spent immersed in a different context, everything changed. But it was a whole month, and it's my first language. And then when we see L2, we usually have 2 hours of exposition a week only. It takes, for us to have, this 1 month of full-on exposition, it might take a year or 2 in our lesson.
Right.
So I try to really calm people down. Look, you're doing a lot already. You've only got 2 hours of lessons a week. You probably don't have so much exposition to English as I have as a teacher. So it's just to try to really be realistic, because I mean, I can tell you can try and travel, but if you travel and you only talk to your friends in Portuguese, do you honestly think you're going to practice?
Yeah, that's
But
a very
it has
good
to do with the
point.
time you spend, right?
So it's
I try to be realistic without being too dissuading. But anyway, sorry. Go on.
no, don't be sorry. I think what's interesting there is that you're sort of talking about actually the practicalities of it. I mean, so adopting something that sounds native, or in a sense of a kind of native, is possible, but it would require an enormous amount of time and probably being there, which is not necessarily something that's worth the time and money that would need to be invested. And actually, that time, that sort of time and money that students are investing in learning language should therefore be more about intelligibility and communication than it should be about worrying about the nativeness of their speech.
It's just the differences in institutions that maybe we teach towards, whereas some will teach towards either British English or American English, and the student can choose between the two. One of the things I'm quite impressed by Trinity is that they have an international intelligibility model. So not can it be understood as British English or American English, but is it an international standard of English? Which I think is very good of them, because I do think that's something we should be more aiming towards, as opposed to sounding like we're from Cambridge or Donegal in some cases.
This is really something that's, I think it's really reassuring for foreign teachers, because we have this, again, the stigma of not being native speakers. And in lots of institutions, they insist on hiring L1 speakers to teach the language because of lots of reasons. Because of this myth, I want to sound like a native. And then again, there's a huge coincidence. Yesterday, the teachers at the institution where I work, we had a session on teaching pronunciation. And one of the questions I asked them was, there's a moment that the interviewer asks the interviewee, says something to the interviewer. He says, that's a very mean thing. And it's a very humorous conversation, and is an American comedian, an Australian actor, a Scottish comedian, and an Irish journalist are being interviewed all together. It's the Graham Norton show, just in case everyone's familiar with it.
Oh, right, okay.
So what happens is the American actress doesn't understand a word of what the Scottish comedian tells her. And he's really asking her about references and how she's become so prolific in her field, how she's become such a star and whatnot. He's she comes to the point of saying, "Are you talking to me?" And there's a point that the Scottish comedian says, "Once I was in America, and this guy came to me and said, are you actually Scottish? Because your English sounds so good." To give this idea that his accent was just so different from this American speaker that, you're actually a native speaker of English. So within the same language, we got to that point, right? And when the interviewer, Graham Norton, talked to her, he has this very neutralized kind of accent, because he spent lots of time in England being an Irish speaker of English. So he's the only person she can actually have a conversation with, because, let's say the quirks of local accents are kind of reduced when you spend too much time outside of the place where you've grown up, right?
Right.
So it's interesting to see when we have this thing of, as a learner for international English as an international language, we have some criteria that we can follow for intelligibility. And people say, the important thing is to communicate, but there are some limits. For instance, if I don't know how to stress maybe a word in a sentence, I will have communication issues. So we still have some things that we have to, like some basics to cover to become intelligible.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, in some places, people have used that to say, no, you don't have to worry about pronunciation. You just have to worry about communicating. So you see, it becomes kind of a gap in the way we teach.
But I think it's also interesting because, two of us at the moment are teaching in non-English speaking countries, and one of us, Alan, you're teaching in an English speaking country. I think this whole English as an international language and local variety importance is different depending on the teaching context, of course, right? So me preparing my Spanish students in English to talk to other non-natives, and Alan, you preparing students at the refugee centre to speak English in Belfast.
Yeah.
The pronunciation we're sort of maybe working towards would be different.
I think, well, for us, I think, as opposed to going international, we use the phrase to localize. So you do have to be able to understand cultures. You do have to know what the crack is, and you need to be able to, understand what's going on in the local country market, which is a degree in itself, really.
Well, I'm just thinking about friends of mine who teach in my home city, teach foreign students in my home city, and it's way more important to be able to understand the South Wales accent specifically.
Yeah,
absolutely. And if someone is learning English in Scotland, then they need to understand the Scottish accent much more than they do worry about the other varieties. So I think it's, as always, probably this question comes down to, well, what's the purpose of you learning the language? That's going to guide the importance of your accent acquisition.
Yeah.
I always try and tell my students, the reality is that I will always sound like I'm not from Spain when I speak Spanish, but that doesn't mean that my Spanish is any less good. It's the level it's at, and it's going to sound slightly marked because I didn't grow up here speaking it, but I can still communicate. You still know what's going on. And I still say the same way. You're always going to sound. You're probably, apart from maybe a very small number of individuals, most of my students will always sound at least Spanish, if not foreign, when they speak English. But who cares?
Good.
I was just going to go on this thing of the local English question. For instance, for your cases, especially which is really interesting to consider a refugee situation. These people are trying to be included in society. They're in a very, very marginalized status, right? And they might, I don't know what their background is, but they might not have had the chance to study English before, or maybe they have, but they have completely different experiences with the language. And if you see, for instance, you study in Belfast or in Cardiff or in an English-speaking city, you have lessons, that's institution, and maybe for some reason you have to do groceries, maybe you have to go to the hospital, maybe you have to go to the park and ask for information. So your immersion with the language is much richer than maybe for students in Madrid or in Belo Horizonte, where I'm teaching. Most of my students, they listen to music in Portuguese, in English, because we have lots of English influences in our culture, but they don't speak it. They don't have to communicate. They don't interact in English, but still, right? Maybe that's the same case in Madrid. So when we teach English to these people, we're trying to teach something that covers what you need to be understood. So we are probably not going to teach them, for instance, maybe the difference between tea and dinner in England, because they might not go to the north, because there's a tendency to go to the south. It's enough if you know how to have dinner. If someone invites you to have tea, probably it's going to be tea, really. It's not going to be something else. So I think it really has to do with these needs, and we're really fighting here. I can say this for colleagues who also deal with teaching pronunciation. We've been really trying to fight to at least have teachers take the same amount of care that they have to correct the students' grammar. For instance, if there's a tendency that it takes forever for our students to get the third person simple present form, which is okay. It's all right. It's a normal thing. So when in level 1 they say, my friend go home at blah blah blah, and then teachers will gladly correct it goes. But if a student says, which is a common thing in Brazil and for Portuguese speakers and Spanish speakers, they will say goes with an S sound. And teachers will not correct them. So why don't you correct them in their pronunciation? This is a really useful pattern to have. English doesn't like to have S as a last sound in any verb forms. It's an exceptional form. So why don't you just teach the general rule? You're going to be doing a favor to your teachers who will be teaching the future levels, and to your students who will be able to understand better. So we have this thing of what is that we have to, what it is that we have to choose, right? So it's just this thing. I really am I get too carried away. I'm sorry about with those things. Anyway, yeah, that's it. Sorry. Thank you.
Well, no, it's funny that you bring that up because it's funny that you bring that up. I don't have it at hand, which is really annoying. But there's a really good. I think it was Robin Walker wrote an article for. I don't think it was in Voices. I think it's in ETpedia or ET Professional, even. Sorry, where he was talking about, like you said, it's like we correct the grammar, but why aren't we correcting the pronunciation as well? Because there's so much. If you get the pronunciation right, especially similar to how you would be forced to get the grammar right, it is such a stronger effect in your ability to read, write, and listen as well. There's this not undiscovered, but sort of like the underdog is the pronunciation, really, where it's not taken seriously enough. But if it's not taken seriously enough, the same way grammar and vocabulary is taken seriously, it can actually have a much bigger knock-on effect than getting the present perfect right in one sentence. So it's quite a good article on Robin Walker argues it's just like how important, and it's like it affects so many other skills. So why aren't we prioritizing pronunciation over, say, the past perfect?
And sounds like quite a good question to leave it on. Thank you, Victor, for joining us. This is yet another it always is international because I'm in Madrid and you're in Belfast, Alan, but an even more international one where once again we have a guest joining us from Brazil. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. That was great.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to another episode of Phrasally Verbocious. If you'd like to get in touch, you can tweet us
at PhrasallyV on Twitter.
You can email us
phrasallyverbocious@gmail.com.
You can check out our show notes online at
phrasallyverbociouspodcast.blogspot.com.
And please like, review, and comment us on your podcast subscription service of choice. Goodbye.
Goodbye.